Ambassador Sarah Chen adjusted her formal diplomatic robes for the 100th time, checking her reflection in the polished metal wall of the Galactic Council chamber. The weight of representing all of humanity pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Today marked humanity's first official session as a probationary member of the Galactic Council, and everything had to be perfect. The council chamber stretched out before her like a vast amphitheater, with representatives from 47 different species arranged in concentric circles. The architecture itself seemed designed to make newcomers feel small and insignificant. Towering crystalline structures housed the energy-based Vorthak, while the aquatic Delphinian delegation floated in their specialized water tanks. The insectoid Zephyrians clicked and chittered from their elevated platforms, their compound eyes reflecting the chamber's bioluminescent lighting. Sarah's earpiece crackled to life with the voice of Director Morrison from Earth's diplomatic corps. "Remember, Ambassador Chen, we're still on probation. The Council voted to give humanity a chance only because of our technological contributions to the war against the Void Hunters. Don't give them any reason to reconsider." The truth was more complicated than Morrison let on. Humanity had been fighting the Void Hunters for 3 years before making contact with the Galactic Council. When the Council's massive fleets couldn't stop the biomechanical horrors from consuming entire star systems, desperate times called for desperate measures. Humanity's unconventional warfare tactics and willingness to use weapons the Council considered uncivilized had turned the tide. But the Council members weren't comfortable with their new allies. Humans were too unpredictable, too emotional, too violent. The only reason they'd been granted probationary status was because the Void Hunter threat still lingered at the galaxy's edge, and the Council needed humanity's military expertise. Sarah took her place at the small, somewhat isolated podium designated for probationary members. The main speaker's platform was reserved for the Council's elder races, the ethereal Aethons who claimed to be the galaxy's first sapient species, the machine-like constructors who built most of galactic civilization's infrastructure, and the telepathic mind-weavers who served as the Council's arbiters and judges. The session began with the traditional harmonic resonance, a complex sound that supposedly promoted peaceful thoughts among the various species. Sarah had always found it rather annoying, like listening to a broken radio trying to find a signal. She maintained her diplomatic smile and waited for the opening ceremonies to conclude. High Arbitrator Zethus of the Mind-Weavers floated at the center of the chamber, his translucent blue form pulsing with soft light. When he spoke, his words appeared directly in everyone's minds through telepathic transmission, automatically translated into each species' native language. "We gather today to address the ongoing Void Hunter situation and discuss our newest probationary members' integration into Council protocols," Zethus announced. "The human delegation will present their strategic assessment of current defensive positions." Sarah activated her holographic display and began her presentation. The data was sobering. Despite their victories, the Void Hunters were regrouping at the galaxy's rim, building massive hive ships and developing new bioweapons. Her analysis recommended immediate preemptive strikes before the enemy could launch another coordinated assault. "Absolutely not," interrupted Counselor Vexhai of the Zephyrians, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "The human solution to every problem is more violence. We must pursue diplomatic channels." "Diplomat channels with creatures that have devoured 17 inhabited worlds?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice level despite her frustration. "The Void Hunters don't communicate. They consume. Perhaps if we approached them with offerings of resources, we could redirect their attention away from populated systems," suggested the Delphinian representative, her voice bubbling through her aquatic translator. Sarah bit back her immediate response, which would have been something along the lines of, "Are you completely insane?" Instead, she smiled politely and said, "While creative thinking is always valuable, Our intelligence suggests the Void Hunters view any form of communication as a sign of weakness. They respond only to force. The debate continued for hours. Every practical suggestion Sarah made was met with concerns about ethics, proper procedures, or the need for more committees to study the issue. She watched the holographic casualty reports from the border worlds scroll past, thousands of beings dying while the council debated the philosophical implications of actually doing something about it. During a recess, Sarah retreated to the human delegation's private chamber. Her aide, Lieutenant Rodriguez, was monitoring communication feeds from the border regions. His face was grim as he turned to her. "Ma'am, we just received word from Kepler Station. They detected a massive Void Hunter fleet movement toward the Centauri cluster. Estimated arrival time is 72 hours. Sarah's blood ran cold. The Centauri cluster housed over 50 million beings across 12 different species. It was one of the galaxy's most important trade hubs and cultural centers. What's the Council's response? They're calling for an emergency subcommittee to evaluate the threat level and develop a measured response plan. Expected timeline for recommendations is 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Sarah repeated, staring at the data streaming across the screens. The attack will be over in 3 days, and they want to spend 2 weeks talking about it. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Admiral Harrison is requesting permission to move the human fleet to intercept. We could be there in 48 hours if we leave now. Sarah closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. This was exactly the kind of situation her superiors had warned her about. If humanity acted unilaterally, it would confirm every council member's worst fears about human aggression and unpredictability. But if they followed proper diplomatic channels, millions would die. Her earpiece buzzed with another message from Director Morrison. "Chen, I'm getting reports about Centauri. Remember your orders. No independent action without council approval. We can't afford to lose our seat over this." Sarah stared at the tactical display showing the approaching Void Hunter fleet. Each ship icon represented thousands of biomechanical horrors designed for one purpose: consuming all organic matter they encountered. The Centaurians were a peaceful species known for their artistic achievements and philosophical contributions to galactic culture. They had no meaningful defenses against this kind of assault. She thought about her daughter back on Earth, barely 10 years old, who collected Centaurian poetry crystals and dreamed of visiting their floating cities. She thought about the promises humanity had made when joining the galactic community, to protect the innocent and defend civilization against the darkness between stars. The diplomatic protocols were clear. The chain of command was clear. Her orders were clear. But sometimes being human meant making choices that had nothing to do with protocols or orders or consequences. Sarah opened a secure channel to Admiral Harrison. "Admiral, this is Ambassador Chen. I'm sending you the tactical data on the Centauri situation. What's your assessment?" "We can save them, Ambassador." Harrison's voice was steady and confident. "But not if we wait for the Council to finish debating. Every hour we delay means more civilian casualties." "And if we act without authorization?" "Then we'll probably all be court-martialed, stripped of rank, and spend the rest of our lives in prison. But those 50 million Centaurians will still be alive." Sarah looked at the chronometer, counting down to the estimated attack time: 67 hours and 13 minutes. She thought about all the diplomatic training she'd received, all the carefully crafted speeches about humanity's commitment to peaceful cooperation and following established procedures. Then she thought about what would be left of the Centauri cluster if they followed those procedures. "Admiral Harrison, you have authorization to intercept the Void Hunter fleet. Full engagement rules. Save those people." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "Ambassador." Sarah closed the channel and sat down heavily in her chair. Rodriguez was staring at her with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Ma'am, you realize what this means for your career? For humanity's council membership?" Sarah nodded. Rodriguez, patch me through to all human diplomatic channels. I want every ambassador, every trade representative, every cultural liaison to receive the same message. What message, ma'am? Sarah straightened in her chair and felt something shift inside her. The careful diplomatic mask she'd worn for months was slipping away, replaced by something more honest and infinitely more dangerous. Tell them it's time to stop pretending to be something we're not. As Rodriguez worked to establish the communication links, Sarah began composing the message that would either save humanity's place in galactic civilization or destroy it completely. She thought about the Centaurian children who would live to see tomorrow if Admiral Harrison succeeded, and decided she could live with whatever consequences followed. The chronometer continued its countdown, marking not just the time until the Void Hunter attack, but the end of humanity's careful diplomatic charade. For better or worse, the galaxy was about to see what humans were really like when the polite masks came off. Outside the chamber windows, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the drama playing out among the species that called those distant suns home. Soon, Sarah knew, everything would change. The only question was whether that change would come in time to matter. She began typing her message to the human diplomatic corps, each word carefully chosen to shatter the illusion of compliance they'd maintained for so long. The galaxy thought it knew humanity. It was about to learn how wrong it had been. The message Sarah Chen sent rippled through human diplomatic channels like wildfire, reaching every ambassador, trade representative, and cultural liaison in council space within minutes. The text was simple, direct, and would have horrified Director Morrison if he'd seen it before it went out. The polite phase is over. Protect the innocent. Do what's right. We'll deal with the consequences together. Ambassador Chen. Across the galaxy, humans in diplomatic positions read those words and felt something they'd been suppressing for months finally break free. The careful masks of civilized cooperation began to crack. On the trade station, Nexus Prime, Ambassador James Walsh was in the middle of delicate negotiations with the Hegemony Trading Consortium when the message arrived. For 6 months, he'd been trying to convince them to allow human medical supplies through their blockade of the Outer Rim territories, where a plague was devastating colonial populations. The consortium kept demanding higher fees, more bureaucratic clearances, and additional processing times that would delay shipments by weeks. Walsh had been following protocol, filing formal complaints through proper channels while people died waiting for medicine that sat in storage bays less than a light year away. He'd scheduled another meeting with the consortium for next week to discuss their latest fee increase. After reading Sarah's message, he canceled that meeting and walked directly to the consortium's headquarters. Ambassador Walsh, the lead hegemony negotiator's translator, rendered his clicking sounds into Federation standard. This is highly irregular. We had no scheduled appointment. No more appointments, Walsh replied, his diplomatic smile nowhere to be found. Those medical supplies move today, or I seize them under emergency health protocols. You have no authority to— I have the authority of basic human decency, Walsh interrupted. Those supplies belong to species dying from preventable diseases while you play bureaucratic games for profit. I'm done playing. The hegemony representative's mandibles clicked rapidly in agitation. This is a violation of established trade protocols. The council will hear of this. Good. Tell them exactly what happened. Tell them that humans chose saving lives over following their precious procedures. Walsh activated his emergency beacon. Within minutes, human security forces would arrive to escort the medical convoy to the Outer Rim. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic station orbiting Vega 7, cultural liaison Dr. Emma Vasquez was watching the Mindweaver delegation explain why human art forms were too aggressive for display in the Galactic Cultural Archive. They'd been having this same conversation for 3 months. Human literature focuses too heavily on conflict resolution through violence, the Mind Weaver Arbiter was saying. And your musical compositions contain emotional frequencies that some species find disturbing. Dr. Vasquez had been nodding politely and taking notes about how humanity might modify its cultural contributions to be more palatable. She'd even suggested editing human classics to remove references to war, competition, and other problematic themes. Sarah's message changed everything. "No," Dr. Vasquez said suddenly. The Mind Weaver's ethereal form flickered in surprise. "Excuse me?" I said no. Human art isn't broken and doesn't need fixing. If other species can't handle the fact that we write stories about overcoming impossible odds and standing up to bullies, that's their problem, not ours. She stood up and began gathering the human cultural archives they'd been asked to censor. "Dr. Vasquez, this is most inappropriate." What's inappropriate is asking an entire species to lobotomize their cultural heritage to avoid making aliens uncomfortable. Homer's Odyssey doesn't become less meaningful because it contains violence. Shakespeare doesn't become irrelevant because his characters have passionate emotions, and we're not going to pretend otherwise anymore. On the military liaison station near the Galactic Core, Colonel Martinez was fielding the 100th complaint about human combat techniques. The Zephyrian military attaché was particularly agitated about humanity's use of psychological warfare against Void Hunter forces. "Your species' practice of playing loud music during combat operations is barbaric," the Zephyrian was saying. "The way your soldiers shout battle cries and coordinate through aggressive vocalizations shows a disturbing, primitive mindset." Colonel Martinez had been explaining for weeks that human combat effectiveness relied partially on maintaining morale and unit cohesion through traditional military practices. He'd even offered to have human forces fight in silence to avoid offending alien sensibilities. After reading Sarah's message, his response was different. "You know what's barbaric?" Martinez said. "Letting civilians die because you're worried about the volume of our speakers. You want to know why we play music during combat? Because when human soldiers hear the Imperial March or Fortunate Son echoing through a ship corridor, they remember they're fighting for something bigger than themselves. They remember Earth. They remember why we're out here. This emotional manipulation is precisely what concerns the Council. Then the Council can file a complaint after we finish saving their civilians. Again." Back on the Council station, Sarah was watching the real-time reports from Admiral Harrison's fleet. The human ships had reached the Centauri cluster with hours to spare, but the Void Hunter force was massive, larger than initial estimates. The battle would be brutal. Director Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece, barely controlled fury evident despite the static. "Chen, what have you done? I'm getting reports from across the galaxy about human diplomatic personnel abandoning protocol. The Council is demanding explanations." "Then give them one," Sarah replied calmly. "Tell them the truth. The truth will end humanity's Council membership." Sarah looked at the tactical display showing Admiral Harrison's ships engaging the Void Hunter swarm above Centauri Prime. The human fleet was outnumbered 3-1, but they were buying time for civilian evacuations. Every minute of delay meant more lives saved. "Morrison, do you remember why we wanted Council membership in the first place? For galactic stability, trade opportunities, cultural exchange." "For protection," Sarah interrupted. "We wanted to be part of something bigger because we thought it would keep humanity safe. But we've spent the last year watching this Council debate genocide while civilians die. We've sat quietly while they told us our culture was too violent, our emotions too intense, our methods too crude." The tactical display updated. The human fleet had successfully evacuated the 3 most vulnerable colonies, but they were taking heavy casualties, holding the line against the Void Hunter swarm. "The thing is, Morrison, we don't need their protection anymore, and they sure as hell need ours." Across the galaxy, other human representatives were reaching similar conclusions. On research station Kepler 442, Dr. Sarah Kim was done pretending that human scientific methods were recklessly innovative, when those methods had produced the only effective weapons against Void Hunter biotech. She released the complete technical specifications for human antimatter containment systems to every species fighting the Void Hunter incursion, regardless of council approval processes. At the trade hub on Proxima Station, Ambassador Chen's childhood friend Marcus Torres watched hegemony merchants deliberately delay food shipments to refugee camps because the proper permits hadn't been filed in triplicate. He seized the shipments under emergency authority and dispatched them with human escort ships. The pattern repeated throughout council space. Humans who had spent months carefully following diplomatic protocols suddenly stopped asking permission and started taking action. They saved lives, protected civilians, and defended the innocent without waiting for committee approval or bureaucratic clearance. The council's response was swift and predictable. Emergency sessions were called, formal complaints were filed, threats were made about revoking humanity's probationary status. Sarah watched it all unfold from the council chamber, feeling oddly calm as representatives from dozens of species took turns expressing outrage at human behavior. They spoke of violations of protocol, breaches of diplomatic courtesy, and dangerous precedents. Not one of them mentioned the 50 million Centaurians who were still alive because Admiral Harrison had ignored proper channels. High Arbitrator Zethus floated at the chamber's center, his telepathic voice carrying undertones of deep disappointment. The human delegation has demonstrated a fundamental inability to function within civilized galactic society. Their actions today have violated 17 different council protocols and endangered the stability of our democratic institutions. Sarah stood at her podium, no longer bothering with the formal diplomatic robes. She'd changed into her simple Earthfleet uniform, complete with the patches marking her service in the Void Hunter War. "Arbitrator Zethus," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "How many council protocols were the Void Hunters violating when they ate Kepler Prime?" The chamber fell silent. Kepler Prime had been one of the first worlds to fall to the Void Hunter invasion, a peaceful research colony with no military defenses. The Council had condemned the attack in the strongest possible terms and filed formal protests that the biomechanical swarm had completely ignored. "That is not relevant to—" "It's the only thing that's relevant," Sarah continued. "You can have all the protocols and procedures and civilized institutions you want, but they're worthless if you're not willing to defend them when something truly evil shows up." She activated her personal display, showing the current tactical situation at Centauri. The human fleet had successfully evacuated all civilian populations, but at a terrible cost. 3 destroyers and a heavy cruiser were crippled, and casualty reports were still coming in. "Admiral Harrison's people didn't die following your protocols. They died saving lives while you debated whether saving those lives was procedurally appropriate." The Zephyrian representative clicked angrily. "Human military aggression is exactly what makes your species unsuitable for council membership." Sarah looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives, beings from dozens of worlds, each representing millions or billions of their kind. Most had never seen real combat. Most had never watched their friends die defending strangers. Most lived in a carefully maintained bubble of civilization that existed only because others were willing to fight for it. "You know what?" Sarah said finally. "You're right." The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. Even Zethus seemed taken aback by her admission. "We are too aggressive for your council," she continued. "We do solve problems with violence when talking doesn't work. We do put saving lives ahead of following procedures. And we're never going to change." She began walking toward the chamber's exit, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. "But here's the thing you need to understand," she called back over her shoulder. "When the next wave of Void Hunters comes, and there will be a next wave, you're going to call us anyway. because deep down, you know that all your protocols and procedures and civilized institutions can't stop monsters who don't care about your rules. The chamber doors sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the council to contemplate a galaxy without humanity's protection. Outside the station's windows, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the political drama but somehow seeming a little less safe than they had that morning. Sarah's earpiece buzzed with messages from human representatives across the galaxy, all reporting the same thing. They'd stopped pretending to be something they weren't, and despite the diplomatic consequences, they'd never felt more human. The polite phase was definitively over. Now they would find out what came next. 6 months after Sarah Chen walked out of the council chamber, the galaxy had settled into an uncomfortable new reality. Humanity's probationary membership had been revoked, as expected, but the practical consequences were more complex than anyone had anticipated. The Council had tried to impose economic sanctions, but human-controlled trade routes were too vital to galactic commerce. They'd attempted to restrict human access to Council space, but too many species depended on human medical supplies and technological innovations. Most critically, they'd ordered human military forces to withdraw from contested sectors, only to discover that several key defensive positions would collapse without human support. Sarah now operated from a small office on the human colony ship New Geneva, which had become the unofficial embassy for what the news networks were calling the Human Free State. The ship moved freely through galactic space, providing aid and support to anyone who requested it, regardless of their official political status. Her new aide, Lieutenant Sarah Park, had replaced Rodriguez after he'd been reassigned to Admiral Harrison's restructured fleet command. Park was younger, more idealistic, and still occasionally shocked by how directly humans now conducted their diplomatic affairs. "Ma'am," Park reported, reviewing the morning's intelligence briefings, "we have 17 new requests for assistance. The Altarian colonies are dealing with another Void Hunter probe attack. The Vegan Trade Union wants our help mediating their dispute with the Centaurian Assembly. And the Delphinian Republic is asking if we can provide security for their research expedition to the Galactic Rim." Sarah noted the irony. 6 months ago, these same species had supported the Council's decision to expel humanity. Now they were privately requesting the same services the Council had deemed too dangerous to allow. What's the Council's official position on these requests? Publicly, they're calling it dangerous unilateral action that undermines galactic stability. Privately, 3 Council members have sent unofficial messages suggesting they hope we'll respond positively to the Altarian situation. Sarah smiled grimly. The Altarian colonies housed one of the galaxy's largest artistic communities, painters, sculptors, and musicians from dozens of species who had created some of the most beautiful works in galactic culture. When the Void Hunters had targeted them, the Council had scheduled a 2-week evaluation process to determine the appropriate response. The human response had been somewhat more immediate. Captain Rodriguez had arrived at Altair 7 just as the Void Hunter bioships began their assault. His task force had engaged the enemy with what the official reports later called excessive force and disregard for collateral damage to enemy vessels. The unofficial reports noted that Rodriguez had ordered his ships to ram the Void Hunter command ship after their weapons were depleted, personally piloting his destroyer into the biomechanical horror while broadcasting Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on all frequencies. The Altarian colonies had survived. Rodriguez had not. His ship's black box had recorded his final transmission. For Earth, for art, and for beings who create beauty in a universe full of darkness. The Council had condemned the action as reckless militarism. The Altarians had named their largest art museum after Rodriguez and declared his death date a planetary day of remembrance. Lieutenant Park, send word to Admiral Harrison that we're accepting all 17 assistance requests, and schedule a secure conference with the other human commands. We need to coordinate our response to the Rim expedition. As Park worked to establish the communications links, Sarah reviewed the broader strategic situation. The galaxy had effectively split into three factions. The Council maintained control over the core worlds and continued to insist that diplomatic solutions could resolve any crisis. The human-aligned systems, a growing coalition of species who had quietly withdrawn from Council oversight, operated under what they called practical protocols that prioritized results over procedures. And then there was the third faction, which nobody talked about publicly. Several of the younger Council species had begun what they euphemistically called cultural exchange programs with human colonies. These programs involved suspiciously large numbers of their brightest military officers, scientists, and engineers spending extended periods learning about human problem-solving methods. The official purpose was to better understand human psychological patterns for future diplomatic engagement. The unofficial purpose was to learn how humans had become so effective at warfare, scientific innovation, and crisis management. Sarah's secure communication system chimed with an incoming message from Admiral Harrison. His image appeared on her holographic display, showing the bridge of his flagship somewhere near the galactic rim. "Sarah, we've got a situation developing that the Council needs to know about, whether they want to hear it or not." The tactical display updated to show long-range sensor readings from the galaxy's edge. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she processed the data. How many ships? Conservative estimate? 3,000 Void Hunter vessels, massing for what looks like a coordinated assault on the entire galactic spiral arm. They've been building these fleets for months while the Council debated proper response protocols. Sarah studied the force composition. This wasn't another probing attack or limited incursion. The Void Hunters were preparing for total war, aimed at consuming every inhabited system in the galaxy. What's our response capability? Honestly, we can delay them, maybe inflict heavy casualties, but there's no way the human fleet alone can stop this. We need every combat-capable ship from every species, operating under unified command with no restrictions on weapons or tactics. And the Council's position? Harrison's expression darkened. High Arbitrator Zethus called for a galactic peace conference to explore diplomatic solutions to the Void Hunter crisis. They want to send envoys to negotiate with the swarm. Sarah closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Even now, facing extinction, the Council couldn't abandon the illusion that every problem had a diplomatic solution. The Void Hunters didn't want territory or resources or political concessions. They wanted to devour every living thing in the galaxy and convert the biomass into more ships for their endless expansion. "Admiral, how long before they reach the first inhabited systems?" 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if they stop to consume the uninhabited worlds along their route for additional biomass. 6 weeks to convince dozens of species to abandon everything they believed about civilized behavior and fight like their lives depended on it. Because their lives did depend on it. Sarah opened a channel to Lieutenant Park. "I need a direct communication link with High Arbitrator Zethus, emergency priority." "Ma'am, given our current diplomatic status, I'm not sure he'll accept the call." "He'll take it. Put it through to my private office." Sarah walked to her personal chamber, a small room decorated with mementos from her years of diplomatic service. Photos of successful negotiations, cultural exchange ceremonies, and peaceful first contact events lined the walls. She'd once been proud of these achievements, back when she'd believed that civilization was built on compromise and mutual understanding. The communication link activated, showing Zethus's ethereal form floating in his meditation chamber on the Council station. "Ambassador Chen," his telepathic voice carried undertones of resigned disappointment. "I confess surprise at your initiative in contacting me. Arbitrator Zethus, we need to talk. Not as representatives of our respective governments, but as beings who understand what's coming. I assume you're referring to the increased Void Hunter activity at the Galactic Rim. We are already developing a comprehensive diplomatic approach." "They're going to kill everyone," Sarah interrupted. "Every Mind Weaver, every Zephyrian, every Delphinian, every species in the galaxy. They don't want to negotiate. They want to eat you." Zethus's form flickered, with what she'd learned to recognize as the Mind Weaver equivalent of irritation. "Your species' tendency toward violent solutions has clouded your judgment, Ambassador. Every crisis has a diplomatic resolution if sufficient wisdom and patience are applied." Sarah activated her holographic display, showing the tactical analysis of the approaching Void Hunter fleet. 3,000 ships, Arbitrator, biomechanical constructs designed for one purpose, consuming organic matter and converting it into additional military assets. Show me the diplomatic solution. We will offer them uninhabited systems rich in the minerals they require for ship construction. We will provide alternative food sources that don't require sapient sacrifice. You'll die, Sarah said flatly. And then they'll use your biomass to build more ships to kill the next species on their list. The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of the life support systems. Zethus floated motionless, his luminous form dim with what might have been contemplation or despair. "What do you propose, Ambassador Chen?" "Total war. Every ship, every species, every weapon we have. Human commanders directing the fleet operations because we've actually fought these things and won. No restrictions on tactics, no debates about ethical weapon use, no committees to evaluate collateral damage. We have 6 weeks to turn the galaxy's most peaceful civilizations into an effective war machine. The Council would never authorize such measures. Then the Council will be responsible for galactic extinction." Sarah leaned forward, her voice intense. "Arbitrator, I know your people value logic above emotion. What is the logical outcome of applying diplomatic protocols to an enemy that views communication as a precursor to feeding?" Zethus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally responded, his mental voice carried a note she'd never heard before: fear. "If we authorize unrestricted human military command, what guarantee do we have that humanity won't use this crisis to establish permanent dominance over galactic civilization?" Sarah almost laughed. "Because when this is over, we're going home. We never wanted to rule the galaxy, Arbitrator. We just wanted to be part of it. But you've made it clear that there's no place for us in your version of galactic civilization. And if we refuse your proposal, then in 6 weeks, you'll discover that civilization is a luxury that only exists when someone is willing to fight for it. The Void Hunters will teach you that lesson very thoroughly." The communication link closed, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the weight of an entire galaxy's survival resting on humanity's shoulders. Again. Her earpiece buzzed with a message from Admiral Harrison. "Sarah, we just received a priority transmission from the Council station. They want to discuss emergency military cooperation protocols. Looks like reality finally caught up with their diplomacy." Sarah looked out her office window at the stars wheeling in their eternal patterns. Somewhere among those distant lights, 3,000 biomechanical nightmares were advancing toward everything she'd sworn to protect. The polite phase had ended months ago. Now came the part where humanity would discover whether the galaxy was worth saving, even when the galaxy didn't want to be saved by them. She opened a channel to all human commands across the galaxy. It was time to call in every favor, activate every alliance, and remind the universe why humans had earned their reputation as the species that simply refused to give up. The Void Hunters were coming, but they were about to learn that humanity's definition of polite had never included rolling over and dying quietly.